You are listening to Insight, the University of St Andrews Physics Society's podcast. I'm your host, Muse. Join us for a conversation with Dr. Adam Bower as we discuss his journey in academia, his current work in space governance, and his thoughts on the importance of organizations such as the Outer Space Institute, bridging the gap between science and policy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Insight. Today, here to speak about his research and from our very own School of International Relations, we have Dr. Adam Bower. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, Muse. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you today.
Thank you so much. So, to begin with, as an introduction, could you tell us what your current position is here in St. Andrews?
Yes, I am a senior lecturer in international relations, as you said, in the School of International Relations. And this semester, I'm actually on leave from the university. I'm undertaking a research fellowship at the Academy of International Affairs for North Rhine-Westphalia, which is based in Bonn, Germany. It's where I'll be working with a number of other colleagues on a project sort of loosely connected around an idea of the geopolitics of outer space. Mainly, we're conducting our own research, but the Academy has provided very generously an opportunity for us to come together across disciplines to be talking on these issues. So that might be something we can come back to later in terms of the interdisciplinarity of the kind of research that I'm interested in, but I think that is also perhaps most productive. But yes, normally at St. Andrews, I research and teach in the School of International Relations and have been there now for about, I think, 9 years, just about exactly.
Oh, and the fellowship sounds really exciting. I definitely want to hear more about that in a bit. So, can you tell us how did you come to your position of senior lecturer? What path did you take?
Sure. Well, I won't give you the all the way back to birth part of it. You probably don't care about that part of the story, but I did my undergraduate and graduate education in Canada, where I'm originally from. So I did my PhD at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, which is actually my hometown. So it was quite a nice opportunity to return home for a number of years to do some further study. After UBC, I was extremely fortunate to have received a postdoctoral fellowship at the European University Institute, which is based in Florence, Italy, which is an amazing place, a really fantastic opportunity. And so I spent a year there at the EUI, then had a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at Oxford University, funded by the Canadian government. And it was from there that I was hired to St. Andrews. And I've been at the School of IR since the fall of 2015.
Been everywhere, it looks like.
One of the fortunate things about academia, I'd say, is that, and and I don't think this is limited to people that study international politics, is that there are opportunities for travel. And I've been really fortunate to have a few of those, and I hope I've taken advantage of those opportunities well along the way.
So here in St. Andrews, do you have a favorite module to teach or a topic? If so, why?
Well, okay, so I guess this is one of those things, right? We'd say in a cliche way, we only love all of our children equally. So I don't want to, in one sense, play favorites, but I think one of the things that is really fantastic about St. Andrews, and really was a selling point at the time when I was applying initially, is that we do have a considerable amount of discretion in the kind of teaching that we do, obviously within some limitations, but to propose modules that are connected to our current research. So I think the module that I'm teaching right now that is most closely aligned with my research interests at the moment and what we'll be discussing today is a 4th-year undergraduate module called The International Relations of Outer Space. And so, I mean, I really enjoy the opportunity to teach across all the levels at St. Andrews, but that is the one that perhaps is most exciting to me personally just at the moment because it's an opportunity to bring in some of the things that I'm interested in my own research and get really bright undergraduate students to be thinking about them too. And the kind of the conversations we have done a lot to actually shape my own thinking on these issues. So it's turns maybe selfishly, right? It's an opportunity to kind of actually draw on these brilliant minds to help push my own thinking forward.
You mentioned it links to your current research. So could you tell us a bit more about that? What are your research topics? What have they been before and what are they now?
Sure. So I think most broadly, I would characterize my research interests around questions of how human societies, but particularly international institutions, try to regulate armed violence. That's been the kind of overriding interest that I've had since probably as an undergraduate, the ways to restrain warfare. And that has been sort of developed in a couple of areas. A lot of my work in my PhD and then in my early part of my academic career was interested in the development of conventional weapons regulation. So I looked quite a bit at regulation of anti-personnel landmines and to a lesser extent cluster munitions. And then I also did quite a bit of work on the International Criminal Court, particularly sort of looking at these institutions after they were created, tried to understand the ways in which as political and legal projects, they were actually changing the way that states, but not only states, include, armed non-state actors, for example, rebel groups, trying to understand the way in which these institutions were actually shaping practices in warfare. Over the last, I suppose, 5 years or so in particular, I've focused a lot more of my attention on outer space governance, obviously the subject of our conversation today. And in particular, I've been looking at most recently attempts to develop new restraints on space warfare or the development of weapons or military operations in Earth orbit and beyond. And what's so exciting to me about that is it was an opportunity to really think about something quite different than what I knew before. I won't pretend to have anything like your understanding of astrophysics, but it did require taking some time to sit down and read the layperson's introduction to astrodynamics and orbital mechanics to understand that objects in orbit and indeed trying to leave Earth orbit and go elsewhere are really behaving in very different ways than we would think of the analogs to a terrestrial environment that I was more familiar with. And so that's been a really wonderful challenge. And it has led to a number of interdisciplinary research initiatives. A lot of the work I do is with colleagues through something called the Outer Space Institute, which is a transnational group of space enthusiasts, but also space researchers. And this is spanning international law, politics, aerospace engineering, astrophysics, astrodynamics, international law, and so forth. And so these kind of seeing these people come together around topics, not just on military security issues, but things like lunar governance, the development of mega constellations, the regulation of mega constellations in future, environmental impacts from space launch or satellite deorbiting, and so on, has been really exciting and really quite a privilege as well to try to learn from brilliant minds in connected areas. So broadly, that's my research trajectory, is to try to understand now and in a moment that I think is quite clearly an inflection point in human uses of Earth orbit and beyond. There are rising dangers, both from potential military confrontation, but also just the accumulation of objects in orbit. And we need new governance mechanisms. And I'm interested in trying to understand the ways in which those might develop, the pathways through which they might unfold, and the possible shape they might take, the content of these kinds of regulations, but also their efficacy. What are the prospects that we can actually regulate ourselves to behave well in this challenging environment?
That's really interesting, especially the interdisciplinary side of your current research. But before going on to that, was there something specific that triggered the switch between what you used to research about regulating armed violence to space governance? Or do you see it as it's still looking at the regulation of something? It's not actually a switch.
So that's a great question. I think in a sense it's both. I mean, in one sense, yes, I do think this is I can see natural connections to the kind of interests that I have had in the past. For just one example, one of the big things I was interested in the development, both of a ban on anti-personnel landmines and the development of the International Criminal Court, was the role that civil society, non-governmental organizations, peace activists, and others had played both in the promotion of these norms and then legal rules at the beginning, but really the role they also played in the compliance process. They're trying to hold states to account, hold rebel groups to account in adhering to these new expectations. And I think you can see a very similar process now in outer space governance. States play a major role. They are still, of course, hugely important, but this is also a domain in which scientists, space enthusiasts, civil society actors, and so forth actually have a prominent role in imagining the kind of governance futures that we might be heading towards, and maybe seeking to avoid those that we would think actually are not ideal. But unusually, and maybe this is the second part of your question, is was this something new or what motivated it? I probably am a bit unusual in that I don't come to this area with an interest in science fiction, or at least not a passion in science fiction from before. It was not an area of literature or culture more broadly that I really knew much about. And it has been interesting because when I talk to people and say, oh, I'm interested in space politics, almost always the immediate response is something to do with Battlestar Galactica or Star Wars or Star Trek or a wonderful book by Ursula Le Guin or others. And that has also been something that I think I now need to go back to because it wasn't my starting point. In a way, my starting point was an interest in doing something a little bit different, but to be able to build off of the kind of work that I had done in the past. And a sense that my discipline, international relations, had been paying less attention to outer space than other high technology areas. And I thought that was kind of surprising. I mean, if you compare the volume of articles and books published on, for example, nuclear weapons or cybersecurity or artificial intelligence and drones, comparatively speaking, outer space was, particularly when I started 2018, 2019, there really wasn't as much work being done. There's some great scholars, but just by proportion, there wasn't as much. And I think that's changing. And it's great that that's changing. And I'm hoping that I can be part of that process of change, of just trying to bring some of these discussions into international relations scholarship. And that really can only be done, though, by reaching out, right? By reaching out to scholars in other disciplines in the hard sciences, but also in areas like what we would call often strategic studies, so studies of warfare and strategy that have actually paid more attention to outer space than political scientists or international relations scholars have. I mean, these boundaries are permeable. They're not hard and fast, and how we identify ourselves as individuals and scholars can be fluid, right? But I think my sense was there was a need to bring outer space more directly into big debates around global politics, not least because space technologies in Earth orbit really are now the infrastructure, the connective tissue for so much of what we do in modern society. And I think until we, as IR scholars, think about the implications for global politics in a systematic way, we won't be able to contribute to policy solutions. I mean, there's academic questions that are interesting, but there are also a whole set of ways in which I think people that study the development of international law, the development of international norms, the role of power in global politics can actually also contribute to these space debates. So that's something I hope that I am in a very modest way helping to contribute to now. And it's been very exciting to be involved in that over as I say, these past sort of 5 years now.
The work you've been, well, what I've read of your work, even though it was somewhat of an initial glance, was really interesting, and it's what you're doing is amazing. So to begin with, can you give us an introduction into space governance?
Sure. I mean, I think, again, this is one of these questions of where would we start? I think the easy place to start, in a sense, is to go back to the early space age. So to sort of think about the late 1950s, early 1960s, and to note that sometimes we talk, even today, in sort of commonplace discussions, there's a sense that outer space is something like a wild, wild west. And actually, one of the first commanders of the US Space Force liked to use this phrase, General John Raymond. And what he meant, I think, in that particular context was that outer space, and particularly military context, was relatively underregulated. But it's really important to point out that outer space is not an area, a physical domain that is absent rules and norms and principles, in part because one of the big innovations in the early development of outer space governance was for states to say, well, look, the international law that we have on Earth logically should extend out into outer space as well. Now, there's a question there about how far terrestrial law extends. I mean, if we were to encounter an alien civilization, they might have a problem with being governed by the United Nations Charter, but nonetheless, for our activities, particularly in Earth orbit, but also perhaps to the moon and other celestial objects within our plausible travel times, there's a sense that we will be actually bringing much of the legal architecture that we've already developed with us. But in addition to that, in the early 1960s, the United Nations General Assembly drafted a series of resolutions, and then subsequently we had the creation in 1967 of the Outer Space Treaty, which, and this is an imperfect analogy, but I think it's helpful to think of the Outer Space Treaty as something like a constitution for spacefaring, like a constitution on Earth in a country, any country we could think of. The Outer Space Treaty establishes a set of broad principles. They're important. They're considered to be quite foundational principles, but they're articulated quite broadly. And they don't necessarily provide us with all of the guidance, all of the particular detail that we need to understand how to act in future scenarios. And that was intentional, right? Because in the 1960s, one couldn't anticipate even where we are today in spacefaring. And indeed, the futures that are being hypothesized may or may not come to pass. The optimism of some science fiction hasn't been realized. But nonetheless, the Outer Space Treaty establishes a set of principles that are supposed to guide human spacefaring. And those have then been supplemented by a series of additional treaties and declarations of principles. One interesting thing to note is that formal legal lawmaking process really ended in the 1970s. And so, of course, we can think back to that time period really dominated by the United States and Soviet Union as the principal spacefaring actors. There were a few others, but they were comparatively much more modest in terms of their spacefaring prowess. There were commercial space operators, but nothing like the volume of commercial spacefaring and the range of technologies and activities that are being undertaken today. And so there's a question then whether the existing space governance architecture is sufficient, whether it is deep enough and broad enough and detailed enough to govern all of the various kinds of issues that we are encountering today. And I'm sure we'll talk about what some of those are over the rest of our time. My own view on it is that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to say, to use a kind of, I think now, a bit old-fashioned phrase. That is to say that we need those foundational principles, and they're actually quite valuable to build on. In some respects, the problem isn't that we don't have enough law, it's that the states and other actors don't appear to always want to use the law that we have. I haven't yet actually said what these principles are, and I'm happy to sort of elaborate a little bit further on that if you'd like, or we can come back to it later on. I think the first point, though, I just wanted to make is that from an international relations, international law perspective, there is law for space. There are principles and norms, governance mechanisms. There are regular diplomatic meetings where states and other actors can go to. And indeed, today, while there isn't a lot of appetite to build new, big, legally binding multilateral treaties, there is actually a lot of work going on to try to clarify the norms and the principles, the standards of best practice and behavior that should govern spacefaring. And that ranges everything from new norms to regulate security operations or military operations in outer space, through to questions about space mining or resource extraction and use, lunar governance, another big area of concern, things like dark and quiet skies, so a question as to whether or not particularly mega constellations in low Earth orbit are going to be irreparably damaging scientific instrumentation that's looking out, whether that's optical or radar imagery, indigenous knowledge practices that are transformed in a negative way by a sky that does not only contain the natural objects but has artificial light sources. So there's lots of questions that space governance can address and that actors are trying to get to grips with. But I think it is clear that there isn't enough yet, both in terms of binding rules, but also norms and principles to actually help guide actors in this more complicated environment. So that is a mouthful. That was a lot. But as I said, I never actually mentioned what the principles are, so I'm happy to come back to that.
Yeah, we could continue. What are the current norms that are applied to space governance?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, again, we could probably go in lots of different directions, and space law is actually an incredibly rich area. It sounds, when you first sort of say, "Oh, I'm interested in space law," it sounds like a kind of thing that being really niche, and I suppose in some respects it is. But there's actually a lot of fantastic academic research that goes on in this area, in part because there actually is a body of law to work with. Going back to the Outer Space Treaty, there's a couple of kind of big principles, big ideas that I would highlight as being the most important, the ones that really set the stage for everything that comes after. The first you can see in the first article, Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says that outer space is intended to be free and open for use, exploration, and scientific investigation for all states and peoples. So there's a principle of freedom right at the beginning. All states should be free and able to go out into space and utilize it. But if you look at the language of that text more carefully, right, there's an emphasis there that this should be done in the common benefit and without discrimination or exclusion of any kind. Now, that raises a whole set of very complicated issues that are difficult to untangle. It does, however, provide a kind of a political touchstone whereby actors that don't have yet as developed spacefaring capabilities might say, look, as we evaluate future space activity, we have to ask whether this is in some sort of a common good and to what extent will benefits actually be shared. Now, arguably, that hasn't really been realized as of yet. But right at the beginning of the Outer Space Treaty, there is a sense that one should expect, we as a global community should expect both freedom to go and explore and use outer space, but with this kind of mutual benefit and non-exclusion, non-discrimination as inherent in our activities. And I think that latter part is the one that's been quite tricky and I would say hasn't been realized. Moving on to Article 2, we kind of condition that freedom that I already mentioned by a further consideration, which is that in going out and utilizing and exploring, states may not appropriate, that is to say, the moon and other celestial objects, whether through claims of sovereignty or, as the text says, by any other means. And so really what this is an attempt to avoid land grabs and assertions of territorial control in outer space. And there's a logic there that actually connects to the time in which the Outer Space Treaty was drafted. Thinking of the 1950s, 1960s, this is the period of decolonization. So the creation of a large number of new states, largely in what we call the global south. So that would be Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and so forth. And those states had indeed a vested interest in trying to point out that if you look back through human history, not only through the colonial period, but much further than that as well, that we see that attempts to control and assert control over territory are a major driver of conflict, not only in the colonial period, but indeed that was an obvious focal point that, assertions by European states of control over other parts of the world not only led to misery for the people that were in those places, but they were actually a driver of major wars. And so non-appropriation becomes a fundamental principle of outer space law and governance. And I think it is connected very closely to terrestrial concerns, experiences here on Earth. That raises some interesting questions because right now we are at the beginning, perhaps, of a period where companies and states will seek to acquire materials, natural resources, regolith, whatever it might be, from the moon or asteroids. And it's not entirely clear whether those practices are going to constitute appropriation or not. Are those claims of sovereignty? Are those claims of ownership? The position of the United States, Luxembourg, Japan, the United Arab Emirates, and some others is that no, that in fact, in situ utilization of resources, so that is to say using regolith to build things on the moon, would be perfectly appropriate anyway, but that indeed one could even envision going to an asteroid and extracting rare metals and bringing them back to Earth and selling them. And that still is not a violation of that non-appropriation principle because it's not an assertion of sovereignty in a conventional sense. That is not a uniform view. It's actually an area of considerable debate in international law and international space governance. So those are the first two principles. The third that I'd highlight as being the third part of that, the real core, is a commitment to peaceful purposes. And you can find this in a few places in the Outer Space Treaty. But in principle, what is really at stake is an idea that in going out and exploring, states are committing themselves to do so without hostile intent. Now, the language of the Outer Space Treaty sounds like peaceful purposes might mean entirely peaceful activity. But what has taken place over the intervening period of time since the 1960s is, I think, a tacit recognition that peaceful purposes does not exclude the uses of, for example, Earth orbit to facilitate military operations on Earth. So many satellites that orbit our planet are being utilized for things like ballistic missile early warning, navigation of military forces. Of course, GPS is an American military system to the present day. It just happens to also be open to civilian uses. Satellites for telecommunications are also used for secure military communications. Earth observation satellites are often used for finding military targets for intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance, and indeed precision targeting of weapons. And so there's an interesting dialectic, I suppose, in a sense, with peaceful purposes as an underlying principle, right? That we are supposed to conduct our activities in space in a way kind of differently than we did on Earth. There's a certain underlying kind of utopian idea that we can go out into off of our planet and behave perhaps differently. But I think at the same time, right, there's a real recognition, and there has been for quite some time, that peaceful purposes really means more not hostily interfering with or attacking the space assets of another. It doesn't mean that you're prevented from drawing military advantage from space-based assets. And those are kind of two different things. There are a great number of other norms, principles, rules that can be found within the various treaties. But I think those principles kind of establish for us a baseline on which to then assess many of the other activities that would develop. So the Outer Space Treaty really serves that kind of constitutional purpose. It has then subsequently been clarified or extended in a few additional treaties and statements of principles. But again, that all takes place really up to the 1970s. Since then, what we've seen is the gradual development of some so-called soft law, that is to say, non-legally binding norms and principles in some important areas around debris mitigation, for example. There is a push on now to try to further clarify and advance norms and principles, sometimes called trust building, confidence building measures in other areas like space security, which is where I'm most active or most interested myself. But as I said, there is, I think, a fair concern that this governance has not kept up with the pace of change in outer space activities. The rapid expansion of spacefaring states, driven in large part by a huge expansion of the commercial space industry. And those challenges, I think, or those developments pose real challenges for space governance. They ask us to think, I think, quite differently about the existing institutions we have and then what is possible to be developed going forward.
And I think that goes very well onto the next question, where you mentioned how those broad constitutions for spacefarer only extended up until the 1970s. In 2017, the US recognized space as a warfighting domain, and the last treaty they were a part of was again back in the 1975 with the technological advancements of space capabilities and also the advancement of social attitudes towards space. What do you make of the speed at which legislation is changing? That is to say, what do you think is the cause for it, the slow-moving nature of legislation?
Yeah, this is a great question as well. And I think it is complicated, both the reasons for the delays, but they also come back to the complexity of the issue area as well. I think there's, on one level, you can see this as a genuine and good faith disagreement among some actors as to whether or not law is the best mechanism for providing the kind of clarity, transparency, and assurance that is necessary in order to have safe and sustainable space operations. You mentioned the United States and sort of the identification of outer space as a warfighting domain in 2017, and that sounds provocative. And I actually think, in many respects, that public declaration is really just part of a longer-term process that the United States, and by the way, not only the United States, had really recognized how embedded space-based technologies were within military architectures. So the United States articulates that position, but NATO regards, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right, the largest military alliance in the world, has recognized outer space as an operational domain. Most Western allies have, in one way or another, articulated an idea that space is a domain in which military activities of a sort take place. I think what partly caused concern with the US warfighting domain language is it sounded like a shift towards recognizing that it would be permissible to fight in Earth orbit or beyond Earth orbit. I don't necessarily think that was entirely what was intended, although I do think if you look, sort of at the US discussions now, they would regard this as being scenarios in which, in the event of a major war between the United States and China, the United States and the Russian Federation, etc., it's very probable that space-based assets would be part of the targeting decisions because, of course, they are assets that are providing advantage for the warfighting that's going on Earth. We're a very long way from, X-wings and so forth flying around and shooting at each other. What we can anticipate is that we would be seeing a lot more by the way of electronic warfare and other forms of cyber attacks and so forth against satellites. It could involve also deliberately destructive acts against satellites, whether from the ground or from on-orbit activities. It's interesting as well, the Chinese and Russian official policy tends to emphasize that the peaceful purposes and call out the United States as being uniquely aggressive. I don't actually think that that is a fully fair characterization of their own policies. I think if you look a little bit more deeply, Chinese and Russian militaries are extremely sophisticated. They're sophisticated space operators, and they have done plenty of thinking about the utility of space assets for modern warfare, and indeed have identified, U.S. reliance and indeed U.S. Superiority in space-based assets and the connection between space assets and terrestrial warfighting as a U.S. advantage. It's very logical to assume that in a war that we hope won't happen, that space assets would be drawn in these ways. So that's one side of it. I think the other part of it is, as I sort of alluded to already, a question as to what is the best way to get. If your desired outcome is pacification, or at least the prevention of hostilities emerging in outer space. So if it's regulations of military or security-based space operations that you're interested in, or indeed if you're interested in mitigating debris in orbit or any of the other challenges that we face, I think there are good faith questions as to whether the best way forward is to negotiate a binding legal treaty with lots of specificity. Right now, in the international context we are in, that seems very, very difficult. Or indeed, would it perhaps be better to pursue what's sometimes called soft law? So transparency, confidence building measures, just for an example, as ways of developing common understandings among actors as to what they regard as, for example, safe or unsafe behavior, sustainable or unstable, threatening versus benign activity, and then build up those kinds of understandings towards increasingly specific rules, where you would say, okay, well, these kinds of activities we regard as dangerous, and therefore we would like to see further regulation by either prohibiting a certain activity or requiring communication beforehand and so forth. To give a concrete example of this, over the last few years, the international community, that is to say states and civil society actors, have been engaged in a process around trying to develop new norms of responsible behavior for space activities. This came out of an initiative that the United Kingdom initially began, and it received a UN General Assembly resolution. Subsequent to that, there have been a series of these meetings, and there has been no conclusion on this yet. But what you see in that process, I think, is very interesting, because it is an attempt by many, by no means all, but many spacefaring states with input from civil society actors to try to talk through what they regard as safe and unsafe, threatening and benign, and so forth, to clarify both what would might be perceived to be dangerous and therefore could be interpreted as a hostile act, and therefore to establish better provision. So one example would be on-orbit activities, what's sometimes called rendezvous and proximity operations, or close approaches between satellites. We know from public reporting that there are at least a few satellites, principally owned by or operated by the Chinese, Russian, and the United States governments, that are moving across geostationary orbital belt, 35,786 kilometers above Earth along the equator, a very valuable area of Earth orbit. Those satellites appear to be kind of moving around in order to get relatively close to satellites operated by other countries or commercial operators, and it's unclear what exactly the intention of those operations is. It could be that they are basically just testing the capability of drifting back and forth and operating within that environment. But there have been suggestions that those satellites are intentionally eavesdropping on the communications uplinks and downlinks from those satellites. Some of those satellites appear perhaps to have tested the ability to move very close to another satellite, even perhaps capture it temporarily and then release. These are always being done in physical context with satellites of the same country, so a Chinese satellite coming very close to its own. These other rendezvous proximity operations have, though, occurred with other countries and other operator satellites. Now, this could be espionage, which we would say is not very nice, but maybe not the kind of thing that would rise to the level of an attack. But what happens if those satellites intentionally or inadvertently collide? And we're in an operational environment where there are a number of very sensitive satellites. The United States, for example, operates very important military communication satellites in the geostationary belt. They also have very important ballistic missile early warning satellites for example, nuclear early warning satellites in that regime as they do in other orbital regimes. My point is that in an instance in which we don't have good information about the causes of a potential problem, we don't know if it was an accident or a hostile act. These are the kind of things that that political scientists, international relations scholars really worry about, right? For an escalatory potential towards warfare. So one of the things that these governance discussions are having around norms and rules is to try to clarify precisely what actors see as acceptable and unacceptable. And from that, perhaps try to build up towards more specific do's and don'ts, rules of the road. So in the context that I've just described, it might be that down the line, we arrive at a norm that says, listen, you're not allowed to enter within some distance of certain secure satellites. My colleagues that understand astrodynamics better, though, tell me that distance isn't really necessarily the most important thing. What you're maybe more interested in is a sort of an energy distance, is how much delta V does it actually take to change from one position to another. Relative distance may not be the best measure, but nonetheless, one can at least envision a scenario in which we say, look, there's a keep out zone around these satellites. Don't come within some distance, or we think of a different mechanism. So this is a very long answer to your initial question, but just to say, I think part of the challenge is that not all states agree that legally binding rules are always the most appropriate mechanism. Just to come back to sort of where I started, the United States has for a long time been very skeptical about legally binding restraints in areas of weapons and weapon technology. And, it's very common, certainly when I was a student, to have kind of beat up on the United States and say, oh, they're the superpower and they won't let themselves be restrained. But I actually think, while I wish the US government's more open to some of these legal restraints, the United States is actually admirable in its willingness to say what they like and don't like. And they tend to view arms control and disarmament measures very skeptically unless they can be very narrowly defined. And they have set a very high bar for things like assurance and verification. And it's true in the space security domain as well. And so the US has been much more comfortable with these more recent attempts to develop norms and best practices rather than seeking to develop a legally binding treaty. Since the early 2000s, the Chinese and Russians have promoted a legally binding ban on the placement of weapons in outer space. It's really been a non-starter ultimately because the US and other Western countries are skeptical of the Chinese and Russian motives, but also the mechanisms of which through this legal treaty, whether it would work, whether it would be verifiable, whether it approaches the problem in the correct way from a Western government perspective. I think that's where we are right now, is a real set of questions as to what type of governance mechanisms are most appropriate. But also it's really difficult to get a very complex international environment. It's very difficult to get a large number of governments on the same page. People want different things. People see problems in different ways. And as I'm sure we're getting on to as well, the addition of many commercial operators really does change the picture, because traditionally it's governments, it's states that negotiate international rules. I don't know how we then do that in a world in which, SpaceX is the largest spacefaring actor by volume. That raises some really interesting questions as well. So I think part of what motivated me to get into this area was just to see how complex it was and how quickly it was changing, and that there are some really challenging and interesting puzzles from a law perspective and international relations or global governance perspective that are really not easy, but are actually really exciting as well.
I suspect from just this question that the next one won't have as simple as an answer as I thought initially, but should we be, as we've been discussing about states, there's also the addition of private actors since the initial writing of the Outer Space Treaty. Should we be pushing for more private actors? Is that something that would be, I guess, helpful, or would it be a hindrance? Or what do you think?
So I think just from a perspective of spacefaring itself, I mean, undoubtedly the commercial sector is really driving the innovation and opening up, so to say, space to a wider array of actors. I mean, if you look at the quite rapid growth in the number of states with some form of spacefaring capability, the vast majority of those do not indigenously build rockets and satellites and launch them from their own territory. They are often buying commercially and then utilizing satellites purchased from a supplier that are launched, for example, on a SpaceX Falcon 9, sometimes even operated by some other entity. And that's great. I mean, that's fine, right? There are services and benefits that can be provided to our world from space technology, and it doesn't require that everybody does everything themselves. I suppose, though, that the question that bothers me most of all is why we do all of this. Undoubtedly, the technology we have placed in Earth orbit is hugely beneficial for our modern lives. I mean, everything from banking and navigation, the fact that we can just know where we are at all times just by looking at our device is an incredible thing. I mean, I'm old enough to remember not having a smartphone and not being able to just order anything I wanted and basically have it show up the next day. There are huge advances for agriculture and environmental monitoring and many other things besides. And so all of that, it seems to me, is to the good. I do worry sometimes when I just look at what is being proposed as to whether or not all of these things are necessary. I would count myself, for example, as pretty skeptical about both the technical feasibility and even the wisdom of space mining beyond the kind of in situ use of resources to, for example, build human habitats, for example, perhaps extract drinkable water from water ice on the lunar South Pole and so forth. So whether we should have more commercial actors, I suppose it really depends on what you're hoping to achieve. From a governance perspective, I think this is one of the really defining questions is, as I say, we are much more comfortable with the paradigm where governments send representatives to negotiate norms, rules, sometimes binding legal treaties. And as of now, the way that the whole rest of the space ecosystem is regulated is then through domestic law. So SpaceX, for example, has to obtain launch licenses from the US government, from the Federal Aviation Administration. It has to have different segments, portions of its Starlink constellation approved by the Federal Communications Commission in the United States. That is sort of the way in which the international level of space law is brought down to an operational level for space actors in most cases. But SpaceX and others are huge players. And there's some interesting questions there about whether and how they would be integrated into governance discussions, whether that's directly or indirectly. Right now, the other thing is that they will, all these companies will be lobbying their governments to then bring those positions to international fora. But it's quite a convoluted process. And it's a really fantastic philosophical question, really, at a deeper level as to who we think are the actors that should set the rules that govern us all.
Also, outside of research, as mentioned earlier, you're a senior lecturer. So I also wanted to get your thoughts on teaching IR. You've studied and also held positions in Canada, Italy, Scotland, now in Germany, and you've also contributed to a forum in May 2021's issue of International Studies Perspective, which looked at how IR is taught in universities across the world. So what are some similarities and differences you've noticed either through experience or secondhand accounts?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to paint with a really broad brush just for a moment here. And I think these are obviously, there's a lot more nuance in this. I think in the longer term, sort of the development of international relations as a discipline. So I'll just speak about IR. Some of these would be lessons or ideas that might apply more broadly, but this is the area I'm familiar with. And sort of the political science international relations field is really a 20th century and arguably a second half of the 20th century phenomenon as a defined discipline. In the UK, that was always understood to be much more historical in nature. So the teaching really drew a lot on international history. And the School of International Relations at St. Andrews, for example, has a really proud tradition of thinking about global politics as in its historical context. And we have colleagues now and in the past who are really international historians rather than being trained formally as political scientists. And so that's maybe one distinction is that in the United States context and Canada being sort of quite close to the US in terms of its educational system, international relations, political science was really heavily influenced by economics and ideas about kind of rationalism through the middle of the 20th century and thereafter. And so maybe one macro level difference that I've noticed in my time is that colleagues in the UK are, I think, more interested in, maybe more open to a longer historical process, whereas the training that I received in graduate school, for example, tended to focus a little bit more on research methods and a kind of scientific positivist approach. Now, that is, again, as I said, a really quite a generalization, because there's plenty of people in the United Kingdom that adopt kind of use quantitative methods, for example. There's a rich debates in IR around methods and the scientific method, or indeed whether or not that's the right approach at all. But I think that that is one distinction that, at least historically, distinguished the approaches. And I've always felt very comfortable in the UK system, in part because I was always more interested in the kind of fine grain and the historical than I was in the research methods. I think the other thing I would add here, and this is partly by way of a biographical kind of comment, that I was a student, and now I'm going to date myself, right? I was an undergraduate student in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and then did graduate school through the aughts, so to say. And that was a period of time which we often in the IR have called the US unipolar moment. That is to say, the end of the Cold War, the decline of the end of the Soviet Union, the decline of the Russian Federation, before really the full-scale rise of China as a global power. And in that moment, I was, going to school in Canada, very close to the US border, and really a lot of the debate, a lot of the thinking was in the mode of a transformation of the international system from the superpower rivalry of the Cold War to whatever this thing was in the 1990s, that where the United States was the last remaining superpower. Democracy appeared to be expanding around the world. There appeared to be the growth of human rights and liberal democracy, capitalism, and so forth. Now, obviously, that trajectory has waned over time, and we're talking more about resurgence of authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, maybe fragmentation of the international order into blocks again, and so forth. But one of the things about teaching was to kind of come to grips with the moments that seemed meaningful to me and in my time, which may not resonate anymore to the same degree with my students. So I was an undergraduate student on September 11th, 2001. I mean, I knew someone who was in one of the towers at the World Trade Center who survived, by the way. But I remember I drove to school, to the university that morning, and every class was canceled. And all we talked about, very understandably, was that terrorist attack. But to be studying political science, international relations at that moment was also fascinating, because immediately the conversations were, was this going to be a turning point in the global political order? What was the United States going to do in response? And of course, the next decade or two really comes to be dominated by the global war on terror, revelations about torture, a reorientation of the United States' entire foreign policy, and with it, international relations, particularly from that kind of American, or more broadly English-speaking perspective, came to be very concerned with those concerns. And I say all of this because my students now as undergraduates might have been born after 9/11. That moment is in the fabric of what they will have understood about the world. It is very much embedded in the research that they'll do and the writing that they'll be reading through that time period, but it may not be real to them in the same way. And so we have to kind of constantly think about the anchor points of the discipline. The other thing that matters here is that international relations has, I think, belatedly, but nonetheless importantly, really started to broaden out the thinking of what international relations really means. And there's been a lot more discussion in recent years about so-called global IR. That is just like our reference points not being starting with ancient Greece and moving through the Western European state formation system and into European-focused colonial encounters, and then to the 20th century and the two world wars and the Cold War and a US unipolar moment, but to actually start asking serious questions and actually learning from experiences of imperial China and the African systems that developed on all different scales before colonial contact, during colonial contact, afterwards, and so on, right? That there are a lot more experiences that don't easily map onto the kind of narrative that was often utilized to develop the kind of core assumptions of international relations as a discipline. So that is by no means a complete process, but it's one that is kind of still ongoing. And I say all of that just by way of saying, one of the things that's exciting about teaching is to constantly ask yourself, what are we talking about? Like, what is it that we are trying to discuss and describe? And we obviously do that through reference points. I mean, the end of the Cold War, the 1990s are things that I remember well. I remember the first things I was really conscious of as big political events are the 1991 Gulf War, the wars in the former Yugoslavia, the Rwandan genocide. These are the things that were on the news that I was aware of as international events. Those are not the same events that a student studying at St. Andrews or elsewhere today will be aware of. That matters as well because as individuals, we enter into a discipline that in very complicated ways constructs a story about what it studies. We as IR scholars, we have disciplinary narratives about the nature of the international system and what matters. And so it has been a very interesting and important and fun challenge to try to rethink those things. Not only as I have gotten older and time has gone forward, but also as I hope as a discipline and as people have become more aware of just the diversity of experience. And that actually matters because it tells us other things about the nature of global politics over time, over space. So that is sort of where I come to it now, is to try to think of what are my anchor points that shaped my thinking and how might they be different than the ones that we'll be encountering now and indeed into the future.
That's something you actively find yourself doing as it comes to maybe teaching. If you were to teach one course 1 year and then the same one the other year, do you see yourself adapting how it's taught, or is this something that sort of happens naturally as time goes on, or also as you go from location to location from different teaching different cohorts?
I think it's something I hope is conscious in the sense that we're always encouraged within the School of IR, and I know this is true of St. Andrews more generally, to really reflect on our teaching. As I said at the beginning of our conversation, one of the many, but one of the really serious great benefits of St. Andrews is having a fair bit of discretion in what we teach and how we teach it, within a set of rules and guidelines, of course. So it's not heavy-handed, but I do think that it is hugely beneficial to try to reflect. I mean, partly because this is much more interesting to me if I'm actually having to think it through, right? This is by no means just kind of rote repetition of a set of facts every year. It's challenging though, right? Because we don't have nearly as much time in the classroom as the complexity of these subjects really requires. And so one of the things about St. Andrews is we are expecting our students are doing a lot of the inquiry themselves outside of the classroom. And so for me, partly it's about trying to provide a framework and trying also, I guess, to be, if not vulnerable, at least admit that, I'm coming at this from a particular perspective, and there's a lot I don't know, and there's a lot I would like to learn more about as well. So I try every year to update the module. Sometimes that's about changing the one or two readings because I've seen that something else has come out that seems good and worth engaging with directly. Sometimes, time marches on and you want to update because something new has happened that is worthy of kind of factoring in. And sometimes it is just, an awareness that we're thinking as a discipline, whatever that means, imperfectly. We are thinking differently about what defines our area of subject matter. In my case, that's global politics. It's a very different narrative, I think, for an undergraduate student, I would think, from today at St. Andrews versus, for example, the way I was taught in 1998, 1999. And that's not to say what I learned was wrong or bad. It's just that there's a lot of time in between and a lot of reflection, not only on the events themselves and their meaning, but also in the ways that we convey and what we understand to represent a diversity of views. And if I can capture a little bit of that, I think I'll have succeeded in something, but it's always very imperfect.
And looking back at your time as a student from the perspective of an educator now, what advice would you have given yourself?
Well, I think one thing that I did well without realizing it at the time was to treat undergraduate study as something like a buffet, just kind of really gorging myself on lots of different ideas and opportunities. And I appreciate, right? Like I was in a very fortunate position. I lived at home and commuted to my university in my hometown. I didn't have the kind of cost pressures that many students have today, partly because university was quite inexpensive when I was an undergraduate student. But nonetheless, I mean, I deliberately took a joint what we'd call like a double major. So I studied history and political science, international politics. But in my first couple of years at the University of British Columbia, I took all sorts of different things because we took many more modules per semester than we would at St. Andrews. And that was just a really wonderful experience. So I guess the advice I would give to students now is it's a different educational model. The world is different. There are, I think, more financial and other pressures, but when possible, think of your university time as like almost a unique moment in your life when you really do get the opportunity to think big things. And sometimes it's hard to see immediately what the so-called practical application of some particular thing you're learning might be. More broadly, like you're learning how to think. You're learning how to think systematically. You're developing critical thinking skills, but you're also developing an ability to read and engage with a huge torrent of information and try to make sense of it. And that is, despite all the changes in the world, and indeed probably because of those changes in automation and the scale of digital technology, we need people who are capable of still making sense of things. Maybe not having the definitive answer, but coming to grips with complexity and from a variety of viewpoints. So I think that's the thing, is that if you have the opportunity in university to go and attend a guest lecture or an evening event in something you don't know about, do it, because through life you may not have those opportunities all the time. And St. Andrews is a small town. It's a beautiful town. The university is a big part of the town, right? And there's a lot going on. And I think that, to me, is the best thing about the university experience, is when possible, just take advantage, because you might be amazed at the kind of linkages in your brain that you can draw from literature, from biology, from psychology, whatever it might be. There's an awful lot of really cool interconnections that we can make from learning. And so, yeah, you're at a buffet, go for it. You've paid your money, you might as well fill your plate.
I completely agree. No, that makes so much sense. Moving outside of research and academia, so the interview is being recorded about a month after the Summer Olympics have finished. Is there a sport or activity that you like to do in your free time?
So I am, and this is probably pretty boring, I like to run. I mean, I'm by no means an accomplished runner, but I find that running is, even 5K or relatively shorter distances, I get a lot of unintentional good thinking done in that time. Same goes for the gym, actually, is that physical activity seems to stimulate good thinking. And so that's my current physical regime. I mean, when I was younger, I played other sports, but that's what I do now.
And a hypothetical that was recently posed to me. If you had 6 months to train for any Olympic sport, which one do you think you'd get the highest placement in?
So I'm going to cheat a little bit on this one, in
Right.
that I don't know if I would get the highest placement on it, but the one that I would probably want to do if I could, and this goes back to my youthful Canadian obsession with ice hockey. As a boy, this was my everything. So I think if I could go back and train for 6 months somehow and make the Canadian men's ice hockey team for the Olympics, that would be pretty fantastic. I was in 2010, Vancouver hosted the Winter Olympics, and it was my hometown, and I had a lot of ambivalent views about hosting the Olympics, but I was in downtown Vancouver on the day when Sidney Crosby scored the winning goal in overtime for Canada to beat the United States in men's Olympic hockey. And I tell you that there will be a lot of things that will leave my brain over the years before I pass off this earth. That will probably be one of the last ones. So in your hypothetical, and thank you for the opportunity to dream big, that would be the one that I would probably go for.
Fulfilling the inner child.
Indeed.
Is there a hobby that you would like to pick up but haven't had the chance to yet?
So I think this is sort of an ongoing one. The two things I wish I had dedicated more time to when I was younger, both because I did both a little bit but not well enough, were languages and music. I love a huge love of music, and so I think if I were to pick up a hobby on the musical side, it would be to somehow find the time to learn to play another musical instrument, piano probably. Languages is the other one. I wish I had spent more time learning more of languages, because it feels to me like one of those, almost as like the ultimate skeleton key for life, that there's so many things. Having spent quite a bit of time in Europe and knowing people that have learned a number of languages, it just feels like no matter what their skill set is, particularly this additional thing that allows them to move across environments, is a really fantastic I won't say cheat code for life, but it certainly is. It helps to position them well in a variety of situations. So those would be the two things. When I'm going to find the time, I'm not sure.
Moving on to quick fire questions. So short answers are fine here, but feel free to expand if you want to. What's the favorite place you've visited?
Yeah, so these are tough because I've been really fortunate to travel quite a bit, and I think probably we're always shaped by kind of a recency bias of things that we've done most recently. And my wife and I spent 3 weeks in Japan this spring, and I absolutely adored it. And it was a wonderful. So I would sort of say, as a whole, the experience of traveling through different parts of Japan was a fantastic experience. And I was able to give a couple of lectures at Kyoto at a university there, and that was a wonderful experience. Probably a place though that when I was a little younger, captured my imagination the most at the time was about 2000, I guess I would say 2006. I was backpacking with a friend and we took a diversion and went to Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it just, I don't know exactly what it was. I mean, we'd probably need another hour to unpack all of that, but it really amazed me. And I was fortunate to go back a number of years later during my PhD research to speak with some people there around the anti-personnel landmine experiences there and international criminal law experiences coming out of the war. And it was just a beautiful place and just a fascinating history. So those are two. We could be here all night though with me recounting the places I'd love to visit. So I will spare you that.
Of course, we can then move on to what's your favorite beach in St. Andrews?
So I guess I'm a West Sands person.
Interesting.
I don't spend as much time in the town as I would like actually, but when I do have the foresight or the intelligence to take a break in the day and actually get out of the office and take a walk, I just love going down there. And it's just a spectacular place. And it seems to me the town, there's something in the air, literally, it's very good air for breathe. There's a lot of oxygen in the air. And I feel like there's a lot of, it's just a good place for thinking. So sometimes just to clear my head, I'll go down there and it's a great spot.
I definitely agree with the last part. It is a good place for thinking, especially walking down the sands and all the way back. Yeah, it definitely helps. Do you have a favorite music genre or a favorite song?
As you're probably gathering by now, I'm not good at short answers. I'll be very quick. I'll try to be quick on this one, which is to say I really have very eclectic musical tastes. But if I'm going back and thinking of kind of the first genre of music that I loved that was different than everything else my friends were listening to was blues. Sort of in my early mid-teens, I got really into early American blues, Delta blues in southern United States. But it connected to all sorts of things that we were already listening to. A lot of there were echoes in hip hop, and there's echoes in ska and punk and other things, right? So now and maybe this is a feature of getting a little older, I'm probably my biggest love is jazz, sort of modal jazz and elements of that. But I was thinking about this in terms of the song that is kind of in my head the most right now, and so I'll put in a plug for a brilliantly talented jazz drummer by the name of Yusuf Days, who's from London, really fantastic and sort of bridging across elements of classical jazz tradition, but with a lot of urban and hip hop and newer sensibilities. And there's a song on his debut album, and the debut album is called Black Classical Music, which is a reference to something that Nina Simone had said, that sort of jazz was the American, or really indeed the black classical music. He has a song on that album called Raisins Under the Sun, and for whatever reason, it stuck in my head. And he's just a fantastically talented drummer and composer, and he's playing with incredible young talent, not only from London but from that area. And London's a real hotbed of this sort of new jazz scene. So it was a good excuse to listen to that album again today. So thank you for that.
Of course, we'll definitely check that out. To round out the short answer questions, do you have a favorite book?
I do. And so I think lots of things that have made an impression on me. But the one that sticks with me the most is The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. So this is a novel written over the span of a couple of decades during the Soviet period, particularly during the years of Stalinism. And it's hard to describe. The highest level of the story is the devil and his henchmen come to visit citizens in Moscow, dressed up or in the character of a set of characters. It is a brilliantly written piece. It is sort of a spiritual commentary in a way. It is definitely a dark satire and comedy, but it doesn't easily map onto an obvious criticism of Stalin and the system, at least directly. There's a whole second part of the book that flashes back to a dialogue with Pontius Pilate and Jesus. There's all of these sort of interwoven stories. It is sort of magical realist in a way. It's just a fabulous, fabulous piece of writing. And it was one that could not be published in full until after the author's death in the 1960s, with the relative thaw in the Soviet approaches to literature. But it is a brilliant piece of writing, and for those reasons, and probably for others, it has just always stuck with me as something I like to come back to.
Very interesting. And so, the final sort of longer question: in what ways can we see the effects of changes in international policy on potential research opportunities in astrophysics? So, for example, do you foresee any immediate or long-term effects, maybe in international interdisciplinary collaborations, such as the fellowship you're on, perchance?
Absolutely. So let me come back to something I mentioned early on in our discussion, the Outer Space Institute, which is currently sort of based at the University of British Columbia in Canada, but is really very transnational in its nature. And one of the things that is fantastic about the Outer Space Institute is it is relatively rare as an example of an explicit commitment to bringing together astrophysics, space engineering, hard sciences of various kinds, with policy, law, diplomacy, governance, and so forth. And that is, as I say, it's difficult, right? Because in academia, we have incentives to speak to certain audiences in our own field or fields. There are disciplinary norms about what you write and how you speak. And it's challenging to get across those boundaries, not least because we become experts in something, hopefully. And it is very difficult to become expert in something very different as well. And so the Outer Space Institute, and I've been involved with them now for a number of years, is a really inspiring venue for doing a lot of this research. So the two co-directors, one is an astrophysicist, planetary scientist, one is a political scientist, international law expert. And the groups that we bring together, they have brought together and I have participated in, range across huge varieties of experiences, but in those kind of areas that I mentioned. I'm a really firm believer that my field, international relations, needs to engage with natural sciences on a lot of the most important issues of the day. I mean, I think this goes much further than just outer space, but just to take that example, satellites don't operate physically in the same way that terrestrial vehicles do. So if we're approaching space governance challenges from the mentality of a ship or an airplane or some kind of land-based vehicle, we're really fundamentally misunderstanding the capabilities and constraints. And then I think from that, we need to talk to astrophysicists, astrodynamicists, to understand how orbital mechanics work, how objects move, what is space weather, how will it affect, how can, how do moving out to assist lunar environment or lunar operations, and we have now a three-body problem, and the objects in orbit around the moon are more distant forms of orbits, whether those are around Lagrange points or distant, highly elliptical orbits that are oriented around the moon, for example. All of this stuff is not intuitive to someone who has no understanding of orbital mechanics. So we in policy world have to ground our policy interventions by understanding that this environment has physical properties and has limitations and enabling capabilities. So the gravity wells and other elements of the space environment both enable and constrain spacecraft operation. And until we think about that, we have a really hard time saying meaningful things about future restraint. If I can give you just a couple of examples, that things that Outer Space Institute has been involved in, for one thing, that they've published some fantastic work on promoting the idea of a ban on direct ascent kinetic ASAT, anti-satellite missile tests. So these are using ballistic missiles from the Earth to deliberately impact a satellite on orbit. Now, up till now, 4 countries, China, the United States, India, and the Russian Federation, have done one of these tests where they deliberately destroyed a satellite of their own with a ground-based missile. Okay, so that sounds bad, but from a policy perspective, you want to know why it's bad. Well, one of the things the Outer Space Institute has done with some of their brilliant PhD students and postdocs is model the anticipated debris field caused by an event like that. So if you can start to show policymakers the physical context of a test and how many pieces of trackable and then untrackable debris are in orbit, at what kind of orbital altitudes, what kind of eccentricities, and so on and so forth, you can start to build up a physical picture that can hopefully motivate and inspire action, but also tell us something about what should be done. That is just one example. We could say the same kinds of things about understanding better the environmental impact of satellites that are deorbited into the Earth's atmosphere. It's only in the last couple of years, as far as I'm aware, that there has been scientific investigation of what happens when you burn up, thousands of kilograms of aluminum and other materials in the upper atmosphere. We don't have a lot of scientific knowledge of that yet. One could predict different outcomes. This could be either positive or negative for global warming, potentially. That is science that is just starting. But if we don't know what the environmental impact of mass deorbiting of satellites into the upper atmosphere is, if we don't know that, it's very difficult to imagine appropriate policy outcomes because we don't know what the costs and the benefits are. So that's another area. I could go on and on. I mentioned the cislunar environment, and I'm starting a project with colleagues at the Outer Space Institute on that particular question, trying to understand better, the physical, the orbital mechanics of lunar and cislunar operations. It's just something that really has not been studied in international relations at all yet. But this is an area with a huge number of new moon missions being proposed, both civilian, governmental and commercial. There is increasingly a sense that we need to figure out governance mechanisms for that domain. My view is it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about governance mechanisms without a clear understanding of what kind of operations are actually plausible and what they might look like. So that's another example of bringing together the astrophysics and more broadly space science, natural sciences with policy people. And I think that's a really valuable two-way conversation. So for those that are listening, I presume many of you will be physics students. There are a lot of really interesting jobs in international politics, policy and governance, for example, on nuclear weapons issues, nuclear security. There are really interesting jobs in the space policy area, whether that's through national governments and space agencies, whether that's through international organizations at the UN or elsewhere. There are a number of civil society groups, NGOs that work on these issues, and we need to have serious dialogue and engagement across these disciplinary divides. I don't think we get anywhere near answering these questions in a satisfactory way without that. So if you're a student listening, there are really valuable ways to bring your expertise into international policy debates if that's something that you're interested in doing.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I found that really insightful. I'm sure all of our listeners will have also found that really interesting to listen to. So thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for sharing your insight, and I think that's everything.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've never been good at the concise answer, as you probably now learned over this time. So I thank you and your audience for staying with us. It's been a really fun conversation. I appreciate the opportunity and also excited to know more, in future about the work that you and your colleagues in physics and astrophysics are doing. Because again, St. Andrews is really well known for a number of things, and this is another one of the things that we're well known for. And I think it's a very well regarded program, but also very justified in that sense. And so I wish you all the best and your students all the best. And I hope to hear from some of you in the future. I mean, I'm away from St. Andrews this semester, but I am around, so to speak, in person and in the internet space. And so I hope that we'll have a chance to speak again.
You've been listening to Insight, the University of St. Andrews Physics Society's podcast. I was your host, Muse. Thank you to our wonderful interviewees for their interesting insights. This podcast was produced by by Muse and Samuel Allen. To find out more about the Physics Society and what we do, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or search St. Andrews Physics Society for our website. Goodbye.